Hello, today on the word poetry, from the epic through the tragic to the infantile.
London Bridge is falling down, falling down. London Bridge is falling down, my fair lady.
But that children's nursery rhyme, like most, actually has a hidden meaning. In fact, a whole history of hidden meanings that we'll be hearing about later. Also, two young poets whose native languages are respectively Kurdish and Bulgarian tell us why they've started writing in English and how the switch has affected their verse. That disasters, floods, wars, famines do become in some way reduced as the centuries pass. The reality of living through your world being turned upside down is another thing. And two poets who've done just that join me now in the Word Studio to discuss the effect on their work of being uprooted from the land where they were born and writing in a language that isn't their mother tongue. Kapka Kasabova is a Bulgarian émigré who, since leaving her homeland, has lived in England, France, Germany and New Zealand, and whose latest poetry collection, Someone Else's Life, is written in her fourth language, English. Choman Hadi is an Iraqi Kurd who's twice been forced to leave her country and, having published 3 books of poetry in Kurdish, has turned to English for her new one, Life for Us. Many years ago, the Russian-born novelist Vladimir Nabokov said about his masterpiece Lolita, which he wrote in English while in exile in America, "My private tragedy is that I had to abandon my natural idiom, my untrammelled, rich and infinitely docile Russian tongue for a second-rate brand of English." But Kapka Kasabova and Choman Hadi, before I ask you whether you see writing poetry in English as a tragedy, I'd quite like to look at the process by which you decided to write in English. Kapka, maybe you first.
There was no process really. There was no question for me whether I was going to write in English or in my native tongue or in some third language. As soon as I found myself living in an English-speaking country, which was first Britain, then New Zealand, and now Britain again, it was obvious to me that I was faced with the inevitability of writing in English.
Choman Hadi, was it inevitable for you that you would switch to writing in English?
Not initially, no. I mean, I started writing very young, and I never thought I would. I thought I would translate my poetry, and I did try to translate them, and it didn't work at all, because partly it was because I think it's more difficult to translate into a language which is not your native language. And secondly, because I think Kurdish and Kurdish tradition of poetry is very different from English, in that it's full of symbolism and metaphor and abstract images and things like that, which when you interpret into English, it translates into English, it just sounds flowery.
It must be a very strange thing, though, writing in a language that isn't your mother tongue. My image of somebody writing poetry, particularly the kind of very personal, sensitive, thoughtful poetry that you both write, is of somebody digging deep down inside themselves, and presumably the language there isn't English.
That's true, but also I think we need distance from the things we write about, and I think using a second language to write in is another form of having distance from the subject matter, therefore approaching them more neutrally.
Kapka, did you find that you had to improve your English quite a lot to write poetry? Because it's one thing going into a shop and asking for some sugar and some bread, but to write poetry requires a very refined use of a language, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and I think probably most writers who make the transition from one language to another find themselves in a period of terrible silence where psychologically you're moving towards this new language, and yet your abilities in the new language are still too basic. I mean, you might be very fluent in conversation, but it doesn't mean you're fluent on the page. It doesn't mean you've absorbed everything that goes with the language, the culture, the psychology, the history, the cliches. I mean, you know, a language has so much baggage with it.
Kapka, would you like to read one of your poems? Because and then maybe afterwards talk about how it is different, maybe in tone or in rhythm, from something that you would have written in your own language.
I'll read a poem which is quite recent, and which I see as one of my Anglophone poems. In other words, a poem which is moving closer towards the Anglophone tradition. It's called Amnesia at Eagle Reach. Eagle Reach is a place in the Blue Mountains near Sydney, Australia. It was the hour of sudden chills. I woke up and I was standing in a room on top of a mountain. Vapors filled the valley below, concealing its depth, a white Styx that travelled slowly between here and somewhere else. I needed to remember, but the trees stood in the still air, their sharp leaves betraying nothing. "Listen," I said. I turned around. Then I remembered. There had never been anyone. So, in Bulgarian, if I had been at this stage in my life writing this poem in Bulgarian, it would have been a lot more, as Choman said, flowery, but perhaps that's a derogatory word. It would have been a lot fuller of imagery. I would have elaborated a lot more. I find the English tradition, the English language poetic tradition, quite understated. There is a lot of understatement. There is a lot of lightness of touch.
Well, Choman, maybe you could read us one of yours. I mean, you're agreeing, are you, that with Kafka, that English is kind of more understated, more spare, something like that?
I think at least currently that's true. The poem I'm going to read, which is, I think, as you said, in the Anglophone tradition, it's called Pyjamas 1983. It was during the student demonstrations when my brother was arrested. Pyjamas 1983. That year, pyjamas were potential lifesavers. When the rioting students were attacked, they dispersed into the tiny roads they knew too well and entered the first open door on their path, which was shut behind them immediately. They wore the pyjamas, drank a glass of water, picked up a book, and pretended to be the sons of the family. Then there was solidarity amongst our people. It was us versus them. Things were black and white. Unlike now, when we are being oppressed by us, even though there is no them.
Well, I find that poem, like Kafka's, very moving in its simplicity. But I just wonder, finally, whether you think that because you're writing writing poetry in this new, sparer, simpler language, do you think in some way it's changing, changing you internally, changing the poet inside you into a different sort of person?
I do find that's absolutely true. I think now at some stage 4 years ago I was able to write in both languages, Kurdish and English. Gradually I have stopped writing in Kurdish.
Like Nabokov, do you find this a tragedy or?
Absolutely not, because I think English is a language of power. Therefore, I feel happy about doing it because I think I have many stories that nobody else knows about, and using language as a tool is very important to convey those stories.
Choman Hardy, Kafka Kasabova, thank you both very much.